There was a woman no one expected to stay and land, no one believed could give anything back. And the moment those two found each other, everything that had been buried began, slowly, improbably, to surface. There was a woman, green-skinned and quietly fierce, who paid $47 in back taxes on 70 acres of kudzu-smothered hill country that nobody else would touch, and what her goats found underneath all that vine and forgetting would change more lives than just her own. By the way, wherever in the world you're listening from right now, drop it in the comments. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Okay, where were we? She was standing at the county clerk's window on a Tuesday morning in early April. The kind of morning that cannot decide between winter and spring, the air damp and smelling of thawed creek mud and pine resin. Her name was Marin. She was 31 years old, and she had driven 4 hours south with a canvas bag containing every dollar she had left after the settlement, after the move, after the 2 years of slow unraveling she did not yet have words for, only the physical memory of it in her shoulders, which curved inward, slightly the way a tree curves away from prevailing wind. She had her daughter with her, Sable, who was 8 years old, and read everything she could reach and said very little unless she had something precise to say. And she had the twins, Birch and Fern, who were 5 and who treated the world as a continuous source of astonishment, and who were currently pressing their noses against the glass of the county building's front door and breathing fog onto it. The clerk was a woman named Dolores, who had processed tax lien sales for 19 years, and regarded sentimentality about land the way a surgeon regards sentimentality about a scalpel. She slid the deed description across the counter without ceremony. 70 acres. Hollow Tree Road, back taxes owed, $47.32. Outstanding since the estate closed, with no heirs claiming. The land had been listed and relisted for 3 years with no takers, because 70 acres of kudzu on a slope was not, in the ordinary imagination, an asset. Dolores looked at Marin the way people in that county looked at orc women, with a flatness that was carefully not hostile, carefully not welcoming, the flatness of a door neither opened nor closed. Marin counted out $47.32 in bills and coin, received the stamped paperwork, folded it precisely, and placed it in the canvas bag. She said thank you in a voice that expected nothing back. Birch asked Dolores if the yellow part on the map was where the treasure was. Dolores did not answer. Sable took Birch by the hand and guided him back to the door. "Some things are only for us," Sable told him. And Marin heard this, held it somewhere deep. Hearts do not empty all at once. They drain slowly, quietly, the way a field drains after rain. And the question is only whether anything takes root before the next storm arrives. She found the property on a Wednesday. She drove down Hollow Tree Road, which was less a road than the memory of a road, 2 tracks in red clay receding into a wall of green. The kudzu was extraordinary. It had not merely covered the land, it had consumed it. The vines ran up what had been fence posts, distinguishable now only as slight thickenings in the green, columns of vine in the rough shape of wood. They blanketed the slope in every direction, a continuous undulating skin over whatever the earth had once held. In places the canopy was shoulder-high, rolling like frozen waves. In other places it lay flat, pressed down by winter, and through those flattened mats you could see that something was underneath, some architecture of stone and timber that the vine had been slowly digesting for years nobody had counted. Marin stood at the edge of the property for a long time. The twins ran ahead and she called them back. Sable stood beside her, looking at the green. "Is it all vine?" Sable asked. "All the way down," Marin said. "All the way down," Marin said. "Then what's underneath it?" she said. Marin said she didn't know yet. Sable said that was the interesting part. She had the goats already. 12 of them, in a borrowed trailer, hitched to the truck she'd bought for $900 from a man outside of Dunmore who'd looked at her hands when she counted the cash, not her face, which she'd appreciated more than she could say. The goats were Boer crosses, stocky and deliberate, and deeply committed to eating, and she'd been running them on rented pasture for 3 months while she looked for somewhere permanent. Paying rent she couldn't afford much longer. The math of her situation had exactly one more turn left in it before it stopped working entirely. So this was not a romantic decision, this was arithmetic with hooves. She released the goats on Thursday morning. By the end of the first week the change was visible. Goats do not eat kudzu the way a lawnmower cuts grass. They eat it the way water finds cracks, following preference and inclination, pulling back the vine at its most accessible edges, revealing in no particular order 3 sections of stone wall, the outline of a terrace, a cast-iron hand pump, half buried in clay, the rusted remains of a harrow. The twins named every goat. They called the biggest one General, and followed him through the progressively revealed landscape, like archaeologists with no methodology, which is perhaps the best kind. On the 9th day, General stopped at a particular place on the upper slope and refused to move forward. Birch came to get Marin. "There's something under there," he said. "General says so." Marin brought a billhook and began cutting at the mat, systematically pulling back layers of vine that had been building for decades, each layer older and more compressed than the last, until the billhook caught on something that rang. Not the dull thud of wood or the scrape of stone. A ring, a resonance, the sound of hollow space. She cut more vine away. Underneath was a door. A wooden door, barn red under the green, set into a stone foundation that disappeared in both directions beneath the remaining vine. The padlock's hasp had rusted to a thinness that parted with 2 blows from the back of the billhook, and the door swung inward into darkness and the smell of closed time, of dust and dry wood, and something underneath that was almost sweet, like old cedar. She let her eyes adjust. It was a farmhouse, a full farmhouse, 2 rooms deep with a sleeping loft above, a stone hearth at one end, still holding the remains of a fire laid but never lit, newspaper crumpled underneath the wood. The newspaper's date was legible in the upper corner. 38 years ago, the house had not been abandoned in haste. It had been closed carefully. The table had been wiped. The chairs were pushed in. A folded quilt lay on the loft ladder's bottom rung. On the mantelpiece stood a carved wooden box with the lid closed, and beside it a pair of spectacles with wire frames and 1 cracked lens. Sable stood beside her, looking at the hearth. "Someone left in a hurry," Sable said. Marin shook her head. "Someone left carefully," she said. "That's different. It matters what you notice about how people leave. It tells you everything about what they were hoping for, about whether they thought they were coming back." The nearest neighbor on Hollow Tree Road was a man named Cade, who ran a timber operation on the 200 acres adjacent to hers, working it alone since his wife had died 4 years prior. He was 44 years old, built in the way of men who work in timber, wide through the shoulders, careful on their feet, with hands that were a record of every season he'd worked. He had a wood stove, a dog named after a river, a supply of canned goods organized by category, and a grief that had organized his life around absence. He had not been lonely in the way that requires company. He had been lonely in the way that has stopped expecting anything. He came around on the second Saturday because General had found the gap in the fence line, and he'd returned 2 goats in his truck and knocked on the tailgate of Marin's trailer where she was reinforcing a corner post. She came out from under the trailer with clay on her knees, thanked him, asked what she owed him. He said nothing, just fix the fence before the rest follow. He looked at the revealed stone walls, the emerging shape of the property, and said, "I didn't know there was a house up there." She said she hadn't either until 9 days ago. He said, the old brewer place, the way people say the name of something they thought was entirely gone. He didn't leave immediately. His wife had known the family, he said finally. The brewers. The patriarch had died, the family scattered. Nobody claimed the property. It just sat. He said he'd wondered sometimes what was under all the green. She said, "Come see then." He followed her up to the farmhouse and stood in the doorway looking at the laid fire and the folded quilt and the spectacles on the mantelpiece. Then he said, "Someone was very tidy." She said, he said he'd help her cut the vine back from the exterior walls before the stonework deteriorated further. If she wanted. It wasn't a gesture, it was an offer of labor for a practical purpose, and she took it as such. He came back the following Saturday. He brought a better billhook and a pry bar for the worst of the embedded vine, and they worked in sections, peeling the green back from the walls in long strips, the house emerging course by course, the way a painting emerges from under later layers, slowly insisting on its original shape. The twins brought them water from the hand pump, which Cade had freed and primed on his second visit. The water ran clean after a minute of pumping and tasted of cold stone. Marin cooked on a camp stove she'd set up in the farmhouse kitchen. She cooked with complete attention and without waste, using everything available, and the first time she handed Cade a bowl of stew made from dried beans and turnips and a rosemary branch found growing wild at the terrace's edge, he stopped after the first spoonful and looked at the bowl as if it had said something to him. He didn't comment, she didn't ask. But he stayed for the full meal and for the hour after, when Sable read aloud by the wood stove's light, and the twins fell asleep on the folded quilt they'd moved to the floor, and the farmhouse held all of them in the unpracticed way of a space that has been closed for 38 years. She had been sleeping in the truck the first 2 weeks. She moved into the farmhouse on day 18. She told Cade she was in the house now. He said good. He said the nights were still cold. She said she knew. He said the wood stove would hold overnight if she banked it right. She said she'd figure it out. He said he was 2 minutes down the road if the flu gave trouble. It was the longest they'd spoken about anything personal, and neither of them mentioned it. The community of Hollow Tree Road extended to a small crossroads settlement called Quarry Flat, which had a feed store, a post office that kept its own hours, and a diner called Maud's, where the locals conducted the town's real business of deciding what it thought about things. What Quarry Flat thought about Marin it had not yet decided, which is not the same as hostility, but is not the same as welcome either. The women at Maud's, when she came in with the twins, looked at her green skin the way Dolores had, with studied flatness performing neutrality. The man at the feed store asked if she planned to stay, or if she was just grazing the land down. She said she planned to stay. He filed this away. Woman who ran the post office, whose name was June, and who was 72, and apparently regarded herself as exempt from public performance, handed Marin her first piece of mail for the Hollow Tree Road address and said, Marin said yes. June said, good, land shouldn't sit. Then she said the school bus came at 7:15 and left at 2:50 and did not wait and turned back to her sorting. Marin registered Sable for school in late April. Sable went the first day without ceremony, came home, and reported that the teacher's name was Mr. Aldous, and that he kept the classroom dictionary on a dedicated stand, which she approved of. She said some of the children had looked at her. Marin asked what kind of look. Sable said the kind that hasn't decided yet. Marin said that was the best kind, because it meant there was still time to show them. Sable said that was probably true, but she was going to need more library books first. The goats had cleared approximately 40 acres by the 6th week. What those 40 acres revealed besides the farmhouse and the stone walls and the terrace was this: the remnant of an orchard, 6 trees still alive though bent and bewildered under the vine, 2 apple and 4 pear, a spring house over a live spring, the stone intact, the interior cold and clean. A root cellar cut into the hillside with a timber door that Cade replaced in an afternoon, and at the far eastern boundary, where the vine had grown thickest, a smokehouse with its iron hooks still in the ceiling and a 3-inch layer of ancient ash on its floor, smelling impossibly and faintly of hickory. Cade stood in the smokehouse doorway and said quietly that his wife would have loved this. He said it the way you say something true that you know will cost you something to have said. Marin did not offer anything in response, because she recognized that some things are only meant to be received, not answered. They stood in the sharp, sweet ghost of hickory for another minute. Then they went back out into the May morning, and General had climbed to the highest point of the root cellar, and was surveying the operation with his usual administrative gravity. She told Cade about her marriage on a Saturday evening in late May, sitting on the terrace stones with the wood stove's warmth behind them through the open farmhouse door and the last light running gold across the revealed orchard. She told it plainly, without performance, the way you tell something you have already told yourself enough times that it has almost lost its power to undo you. She told him about the 8 years of it, about the way it had worked, which was not in sudden dramatic acts, but in the slow daily work of making her doubt what she saw and heard and knew, of using her children's orc blood as a source of shame in public and a weapon in private. Of the way documents can be used against a person when a person's name is on nothing and their partner's name is on everything. She told him about the morning she left, which had required 9 months of preparation conducted in secret, small amounts of cash withdrawn over time, documents copied and stored with a woman she trusted, a plan that had to be perfect because imperfect meant losing the children to a man who would use them as leverage and call it love. She said she'd made it out. She said the settlement had left her $47 more than the cost of a parcel of kudzu-covered hill, and she'd spent it all on a deed. Cade listened without moving. When she finished, he said, "You prepared for 9 months." She said, "Yes." He said, "Alone." She said, "Yes." He was quiet again, and then he said that was the most capable thing he'd heard in a long time. He looked at him to check whether he meant it, the way it sounded, and his expression was plain and direct, and she looked away because she was not accustomed yet to being seen clearly. She said she was sorry. She didn't usually talk this much. He said she hadn't said anything she needed to apologize for. She said it was a habit. He said he'd noticed. And then neither of them said anything for a while, and the light finished its business with the orchard, and the evening came in cool and smelling of the spring below, and of whatever was rooted and alive in that hillside. The carved wooden box on the farmhouse mantelpiece had stayed closed for the 6 weeks Marin had been in the house. On a Sunday morning in early June she opened it. Inside was a folded list of the property's fruit trees and their planting dates, a small brass button with an eagle on it, 2 locks of hair tied with thread, a seed packet empty of seeds but still carrying the image of a variety of beans she'd never heard of, and a single photograph, creased down the middle, plain, of a couple standing in front of the farmhouse before the vine had reached it, the house visible in its full form, stone and timber, and a porch she hadn't yet found beneath the vine on the south face. The couple stood very close together but not touching, looking at the camera with the serious directness of people who understood that a photograph was a record for people they'd never meet. She put everything back, closed the lid, and stood with her hands on the mantelpiece for a moment. Then she went out to start the goats on the south face. The porch was there, exactly as the photograph promised. Her ex-husband's name was Rowan Calvert, and he arrived in Quarry Flat on a Thursday in late June, in a car that was newer than anything on Hollow Tree Road, with a man she didn't recognize who turned out to be a lawyer named Sefton who had papers. Calvert was 40 years old, and he dressed with the careful precision of a man who understood that clothing was argumentation, that a pressed collar says things to a jury that words cannot. In public he was warm and generous and quick to laugh, and he spoke of Marin before others with a patient sorrow that implied she was troubled, that the children were his primary concern. He had been practicing this performance for 8 years, and it was very good. He did not come to the farmhouse first. He went to Maud's diner at breakfast on a Thursday, sat at the counter. What he said was shaped like concern, but built like a case. His children in an unstable situation, a woman whose mental state he worried about, and an orc community's tendency, he said carefully, towards certain kinds of impulsive decisions. He said it all with such measured gentleness that it took a moment for the room to hear what was underneath it. He left a generous tip and drove up Hollow Tree Road with Sefton and the papers. Marin heard the car before she saw it. She was in the orchard, clearing the last vine from the apple tree roots with a spade. She stood up straight and recognized the particular quality of dread that hit her. The way cold water hits, complete and instant, the body remembering what the mind has almost managed to reorganize. She breathed through it. She set the spade against the nearest apple tree. She walked down with her hands at her sides. Sefton served the papers without ceremony. A petition to the family court for reassessment of the custody arrangement, on grounds of material change in circumstances, relocation to what was described as an uninhabitable rural structure with no established utilities, no verified income. This was built on a version of the facts, which is how the best weapons are built, not from lies, but from the selection of true things. The petition also noted, in careful legal language, that the children's maternal heritage presented considerations that a rural community with limited diversity exposure, might not be equipped to address which was the weapon underneath the weapon. Calvert stood behind Sefton, looking at the farmhouse and its cleared stone walls and the revealed porch and the goats working the far pasture, and his expression was the one he used when deciding what to feel, which is different from actually feeling anything. He said her name as if relieved to see her. He said the children were all that mattered. He said all of this at a volume slightly above what the two of them required, which was not an accident. Marin took the papers from Sefton and said she would need time to review them. Calvert said, of course. He said he hoped she could see he just wanted what was best. She did not answer this. She said she'd be in touch through her attorney and turned back toward the house. She did not have an attorney, she told Cade that evening. He listened to the whole of it. Her name was Aldine Marsh. She'd retired from family law practice the year before but had not yet surrendered her license. She lived 12 minutes away and had been known to Cade for 15 years, and did not, he said with precision, like men who use legal language to dress up cruelty. He said he would call her in the morning. Marin said she couldn't pay much. Cade said Aldine would work something out. And the something would be fair, and the fairness was the point. He said it the way he said most things, briefly and absolutely. Aldine Marsh was 67 years old, compact, with silver haircut, practical and reading glasses she wore on a chain. She came to the farmhouse on a Saturday morning, accepted coffee, looked around the interior with the eye of someone assessing structure rather than comfort, and said, "This is a sound house." Then she sat at the table and read the petition in its entirety, without comment. When she was done, she set it down and said, "He's done this before. Not to you, as a tactic." She said she recognized the construction of it. She said it was sophisticated, and it was cowardly, and it was going to need to be taken apart piece by piece, in front of people who could see it clearly. She asked Marin for everything. Every document from the settlement, every record of the 9 months of preparation, every piece of evidence that the house was habitable and improving, every record of the children's health and schooling since arrival. She asked about June. She asked about the spring and the root cellar and the orchard. She said she was building a picture of a woman who had arrived with nothing and made something real in full view of a community that could speak to it. Marin said she didn't know if the community would speak to it. Aldine said she'd been coming to Quarry Flat for 15 years, and she thought Marin was underestimating something. Calvert had made a mistake, coming into that diner and saying what he'd said, she explained, because what he had said about Orc heritage and what a community was equipped for. People hear things differently, she said, when an outsider says them about their neighbors than when they say them about each other. Calvert had walked into Maud's and insulted every person in that room's judgment in the same sentence he'd used as a weapon, and that was a tactical error she intended to make full use of. The hearing was set for a Thursday in mid-July, held at the County Family Court building in the same town where Marin had paid $47.32 to Dolores 3 months and 11 days before. The room was smaller than a courtroom meant for the quieter business of family matters. And it was not quiet that Thursday. June, from the post office, was there in her good coat. Oldest Sable's teacher read into the record a written statement about Sable's academic performance and social adjustment with a deliberateness that said he understood exactly what it meant. The man from the feed store, whose name Marin had learned was Harold, was there. having apparently decided somewhere between their first and fourth transaction that she paid her debts and worked her land and kept her word, which was his complete criteria for a neighbor. Cade was at the end of the row in a collared shirt that suggested he owned one. And there was a healer named Vera who ran a small practice out of Quarry Flat and who had seen the twins for a spring illness in May and brought her own records of their condition. Children with clear eyes and good color, and the particular settled confidence of children who know where they are sleeping tonight and the night after. Calvert sat at his table with Sefton and his pressed collar and his patient, sorrowful expression, and he watched the room fill, and something shifted in him by a fraction that only Marin and perhaps Aldine could read, the slight recalibration of someone who has misread the room. He composed himself, and when the judge opened the proceedings, he spoke with all his practiced warmth about instability and improvisation, about heritage and community fit. The judge was a woman named Cortez who had been on the bench for 11 years and had the particular quality of attention of someone who has spent a decade listening to the space between what people say and what they mean. She let Calvert finish. Then she said she had some questions of her own before hearing response, and what she asked him was precise and incremental, each question a small step closer to the center of things. Calvert answered with the confidence of a man who is very good at being technically accurate and substantively misleading, and this worked for the first 4 questions, and then Judge Cortez asked him to confirm the date of the property settlement, the amount Marin had received, and the marital home's assessed value. And then she did. The arithmetic allowed d'affour. Slowly, and the room heard what the numbers said about what Marin had walked away with after 8 years and 3 children, and what they said was very plain and very small. Aldine stood and was methodical. She entered the photographs of the farmhouse dated. She entered the deed and the tax payment record. She entered Vera's medical notes. She entered Mr. Aldis's statement. She entered the certificate from the county building inspector who had visited the farmhouse the previous Tuesday at Aldine's request and certified it as structurally sound, with working water from a verified spring, a functional wood stove, and assessed as a habitable dwelling with ongoing improvements. She entered June's letter, 2 paragraphs long and plain-spoken, noting that in 40 years of running the post office, she had developed a reliable sense for people putting down roots versus people passing through. Then Marin spoke. She had not planned a speech. She stood and looked at Judge Cortez and said what had happened in 8 years, without softening any of it, without the instinctive apology she'd spent 2 years unlearning from her voice, without the careful hedging that Calvert's presence had trained into her the way you train an animal to make itself small. She said it factually and completely, and she said it looking directly at the judge, and once briefly at the room, and the room was very quiet. The quality of the quiet was not neutral. It was the quiet of people hearing something they are choosing to believe. Calvert's lawyer objected twice. The judge sustained neither objection. When Marin finished, Calvert said her name in his careful way, starting to speak, and Judge Cortez said she'd heard enough from him and turned to her papers. She found insufficient grounds to modify the existing custody arrangement. She found the children's current living situation stable, improving, and well supported by community evidence. She found the petition's language regarding the children's heritage, she said, precisely, not merely unhelpful, but reflective of a bias the court would note for the record. The petition was denied. Calvert wished to return with a subsequent petition. The threshold of evidence would be correspondingly higher. They were adjourned. Calvert gathered his papers and said something quietly to Sefton, and they walked out of the room. Without looking at the row of people who had come, he did not look back at Marin. He walked out with his pressed collar and his polished shoes, and the careful composure of a man deciding which story he will tell himself about this later, and the door closed behind him, and that was all. Cade was standing in the hallway when Marin came out. He'd left the room before the crowd moved, and was at the window at the end of the hall looking out over the courthouse square, and when she came out, he turned and his face was doing something it didn't often do, which was to express what he felt without any management of it, and what it expressed was straightforward and complete. He said, "All right then." She said, "All right then." Harold shook her hand on his way past and said she had good land and knew what to do with it, which from Harold was an oration. June patted her arm and said she'd be expecting her regular mail pickup on Monday. Vera said the children were well and she'd see them for their fall checks. All this said, Sable had requested 3 specific titles for the school library, and they'd be in by September. The drive back to Hollow Tree Road took 40 minutes, and she drove it with both windows down, and the summer coming in off the fields, the smell of warm grass and red clay, and the beginning of something, and she did not talk, and Cade did not talk, and it was the comfortable kind of quiet. The kind that has earned itself. The porch on the south face needed new timber in 2 of its boards. Cade cut them from salvage timber of the right age and weight, and fitted them on a Saturday in late July, while Marin painted the farmhouse door the same barn red it had been under the vine. The twins ran underneath the porch with General, who had claimed the shade as his administrative office. Sable sat on the new boards with her back against the stone wall and announced that the boards didn't bounce, which was her standard for structural integrity. Cade said he'd try harder next time. Sable said that was the right attitude. The orchard gave in September, not abundantly, not the first year after decades of neglect, but honestly, the way recovering things give. 4 bushels of small, firm apples, 6 of pears still sweet under their uneven skins. Marin used the smokehouse for the first time in late October with a supply of hickory chips and 4 hams she'd traded 3 goats for with a farmer 2 roads over, and the smoke rose from the chimney of the small stone outbuilding and drifted across the hillside and through the pear trees, and Cade came out of the tree line when he smelled it and stood at the edge of the clearing and just breathed for a moment with his eyes closed, and Marin let him. She found the variety of bean from the seed packet at an heirloom seed exchange in November, listed under an old regional name. She ordered a 1/4 pound of seed and planned the garden plot for spring on the terrace where the soil was deep and south-facing and warm. He asked her on a Sunday in November. It was not a speech. It was in its structure more like one of Harold's assessments, brief and factual and grounded in what he had observed over 7 months of Saturdays and evenings, and the kind of proximity that grows when 2 people stop pretending they are not paying attention to each other. He said he was not asking her to stop being what she was or to need less than she needed. He said he was asking if she wanted company that was not going anywhere. She looked at him for a long moment, and she thought of the farmhouse closed for 38 years, and the fire laid but never lit, and the table wiped, and the chairs pushed in. And she thought of opening the door and the room, remembering what it was for. She said yes. She said it plainly and without apology. And it landed in the room and stayed there, solid and warm and unhurried. They were married in December, in the farmhouse, with the wood stove banked high, and the porch holding the guests who couldn't fit inside, which was most of them. June and Harold and Vera and Mr. Aldous were there, and several people from Quarry Flat who had made up their minds without announcement and arrived with food. Aldine brought a bottle of something serious. Sable stood very straight and watched everything with her precise dark eyes, and at the right moment took Cade's hand without being asked, because she had decided, and Sable, once she decided. Birch announced to the assembled guests that General had wanted to attend, but had been judged a flight risk, and was in the pen, which he felt was worth noting for the record. Fern fell asleep in the chair by the wood stove before the toasts, and had to be carried up to the loft and tucked in with the folded quilt that had waited 38 years on the ladder rung for someone to need it. Marin stood in the farmhouse that evening after the guests had gone and the children were sleeping and Cade was washing the last of the cups at the basin, and she stood in the room she had walked into through a door cut out of vine and forgetting, in the house that $47 had given her, on the land her goats had uncovered acre by acre. And she held the carved wooden box from the mantelpiece and was quiet for a moment. And then she put it back in its place, and beside it she set a small clay figure Fern had made in school, and painted green and presented to her solemnly as a household guardian. And the old box and the new figure stood together on the mantelpiece in the wood stove's light, and neither one required the other to give way. The bean seeds went in the following May, in the deep south-facing soil of the terrace, and came up strong. She sang to them while she worked. An old song she'd stopped singing somewhere in the middle of 8 years, and had only recently remembered she knew. Her voice was low and a little rough at first, unused, and then it found itself, and she let it. General observed from the high ground the smoke of the hickory moved through the orchard. The farmhouse stood, with its barn-red door open to the morning, the way it had always been meant to stand. The measure of a life is not what it loses, but what it is willing to let take root beside the loss. Some things wait a long time in the dark and grow stronger for the waiting, and some doors, once opened, let in enough light to last a lifetime.